Secret Service agent detained after being mistaken for a threat, a lesson on racial bias. In the quiet hum of a bustling airport, the world moves fast, and assumptions are often made in the blink of an eye. For some, these assumptions carry little weight, but for others, they can mean the difference between dignity and humiliation, safety and danger. This is the story of one such moment, where bias collided with duty and the outcome shocked everyone involved. On a seemingly routine day, a highly trained federal agent boarded a commercial flight. His name was Agent Marcus Hayes, a seasoned professional tasked with a mission of utmost importance to ensure the safety of the President of the United States. Marcus, dressed inconspicuously in civilian clothes, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the weight of responsibility. His eyes scanned the cabin, every detail under his scrutiny, though his demeanor betrayed none of it. His mission required discretion, and Marcus was an expert at blending into his surroundings. But discretion came with its own risks. Marcus was used to being overlooked, dismissed, or even doubted, especially when his qualifications were not immediately visible. As a black man working in elite federal security, he had navigated a world of skepticism his entire career. Yet he was unwavering in his duty, knowing the stakes were far too high for distractions. The flight was running on schedule, with passengers settling into their seats, chatting lightly, or scrolling through their devices. But as Marcus adjusted his position to conceal his holstered weapon, standard issue for his role, two figures entered the cabin with purposeful strides. Officers Ben Taylor and Ryan Hobbs, local law enforcement officers assigned to monitor airport security, were scanning the rows of passengers. Their eyes swept over faces, pausing briefly on Marcus. Their gazes lingered just long enough for suspicion to take root. To them, Marcus didn't look like he belonged. His calm authority, his reserved demeanor, his watchfulness, all of it struck them as unusual. The officers exchanged silent glances, their unspoken doubts feeding into each other. To them, Marcus wasn't just a passenger. He was a potential problem. It didn't matter that Marcus was exactly where he needed to be, performing a critical task for national security. To these officers, appearances carried more weight than reality, and their assumptions were quickly solidifying into certainty. What happened next would not only alter the course of that flight, but also serve as a sobering reminder of the consequences of jumping to conclusions. In the chaos that ensued, lives were jeopardized, reputations questioned, and the fragility of trust was laid bare. But for Marcus Hayes, this moment wasn't just a professional crisis. It was deeply personal. It was a collision of identity and duty, where his integrity and composure would be tested like never before. As the stage was set for confrontation, none of the officers, passengers, or even Marcus himself could have foreseen how this would end, or the powerful lesson it would teach. Agent Marcus Hayes settled into his seat, his eyes scanning the rows of passengers as they boarded. Every movement, every expression, and every detail in the cabin was noted. It was a skill honed over years of high-pressure assignments, and one that often kept him, and the individuals he protected, alive. To an untrained eye, Marcus appeared calm and unassuming, a man simply minding his own business. But in reality, he was a fortress of vigilance, his mind constantly calculating, assessing, and preparing for the unexpected. Dressed in plain clothes, Marcus avoided drawing attention to himself. His simple attire and composed demeanor were all part of his role. Blend in, observe, and act only when necessary. He shifted slightly in his seat, ensuring the holstered firearm at his side was fully concealed, a standard precaution for agents like him, even when traveling in commercial settings. As passengers continued to board, Marcus noticed two uniformed law enforcement officers enter the cabin. Officers Ben Taylor and Ryan Hobbs were not part of the flight crew, but had been assigned to airport security. Their task was straightforward: ensure that all passengers adhered to regulations and that the flight was cleared for takeoff. As they walked down the aisle, their eyes scanned each face with practiced precision. When their gaze landed on Marcus, it lingered just a second too long. To the officers, Marcus didn't fit their preconceived image of who should be sitting alone on a flight that would soon carry the President of the United States. He had an air of quiet authority, one that didn't align with their expectations. His reserved demeanor and focused expression stood out in a cabin otherwise filled with casual chatter and idle scrolling. For Taylor and Hobbs, his calmness didn't suggest professionalism. It suggested something to be wary of. They exchanged glances, their eyebrows raising ever so slightly. Without saying a word, their suspicions began to grow. Taylor, the senior officer, glanced back at Marcus once more before leaning toward his partner. "You see that guy?" he muttered under his breath. "Yeah," Hobbs replied, his tone cautious but intrigued. "Doesn't look like your average passenger." Their shared assumptions began to snowball, feeding off each other's unease. Instead of questioning why they felt this way, they began silently affirming their suspicions. Marcus wasn't doing anything wrong. In fact, he was sitting perfectly still, his posture relaxed but attentive. Yet, in their minds, his very presence became a question mark. The officers moved to their seats a few rows behind Marcus, but their focus never wavered. From their vantage point, every minor movement he made seemed to reinforce their suspicions. If Marcus adjusted his posture, they saw it as tension. If he glanced around the cabin, they interpreted it as hyper-awareness. And the firearm he carried, hidden but briefly glimpsed as he shifted in his seat, seemed to confirm their worst fears. The seconds dragged into minutes, and with each passing moment, their certainty grew. The narrative they were building in their minds became a dangerous echo chamber, one where logic and protocol gave way to fear and prejudice. Taylor leaned toward Hobbs again, his voice low but firm. "We need to check this guy out," he said. "You sure?" Hobbs replied, glancing toward Marcus. "Absolutely," Taylor said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Something about him doesn't sit right." By now, their suspicions had solidified into action. They believed they were being vigilant, protecting the passengers and the president. What they didn't realize was that their assumptions, unchecked and unchallenged, were about to set a catastrophic series of events into motion. Marcus Hayes, still unaware of their growing fixation, remained focused on his mission. But the officers had already made up their minds, and their next move would change everything. The tension in the cabin was almost imperceptible to the other passengers, but for Marcus Hayes, it was palpable. Years of experience had sharpened his instincts, and he could feel the weight of the officer's stares from a few rows back. He chose not to react, keeping his focus on the task at hand, monitoring the cabin for any potential threats. Still, his training told him that a confrontation was brewing. He just didn't know when. Officers Taylor and Hobbs, seated behind Marcus, had been quietly debating their next step. To them, the presence of a firearm, even though concealed, was a glaring red flag. They hadn't stopped to consider that federal agents often traveled armed, or that Marcus's calm demeanor might be indicative of professionalism rather than deceit. Instead, their assumptions painted him as a potential threat. Their decision was made. Taylor stood first, his movement deliberate and commanding. Hobbs followed, the two officers stepping into the aisle and making their way toward Marcus. Their faces were carefully neutral, but their stances betrayed a tension that had been building for the past several minutes. When they reached his row, Taylor leaned slightly toward Marcus, his voice firm but not loud. "Sir, may we see some identification?" he asked. Marcus looked up, his expression calm but alert. He could read the officer's body language as easily as a book, and it was clear they had already decided he was a problem. He chose his words carefully. "Of course," he said evenly, reaching slowly for his pocket. "I'm a federal agent with the—" "We'll need to see that ID first," Taylor interrupted, his tone dismissive. His hand hovered near his own holstered firearm, a gesture not lost on Marcus. Hobbs stood slightly behind, his posture stiff and watchful. Marcus retrieved his credentials, holding them out for Taylor to examine. "Agent Marcus Hayes, Secret Service," he said, keeping his voice measured. Taylor took the badge, glancing at it briefly before passing it to Hobbs. Neither officer seemed convinced. "Secret Service, huh?" Taylor said, his tone laced with skepticism. "And what exactly are you doing on this flight?" "I'm here on official duty," Marcus replied. "The president is scheduled to board soon, and I'm part of his protective detail." Hobbs raised an eyebrow, his doubt evident. Protective detail? On a commercial flight? That doesn't add up. Marcus remained patient, though his frustration was beginning to simmer. "I understand your concerns," he said. But if you check with your supervisors, you'll find that everything I'm saying is accurate. Before he could continue, Hobbs's gaze dropped to Marcus's side, where the faint outline of the holstered weapon was visible beneath his jacket. His eyes widened, and he took a step back, his hand moving instinctively to his own gun. "He's armed!" Hobbs exclaimed, his voice cutting through the cabin like a knife. "Everyone, stay calm." The declaration sent a ripple of panic through the passengers. People gasped, some ducking down in their seats, while others craned their necks to see what was happening. Marcus raised his hands slowly, his voice steady as he tried to de-escalate the situation. "I'm authorized to carry this weapon," he said. "Please let me explain." "Get on the ground!" Taylor barked, drawing his firearm and aiming it directly at Marcus. Hobbs followed suit, his hands trembling slightly as he leveled his weapon. Marcus complied, lowering himself to the floor with deliberate slowness. He understood that any sudden movement could escalate the situation further. "Listen to me," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "I'm here to protect the president. Removing me compromises his safety." Taylor and Hobbs ignored his words, their actions driven by the fear they had created in their own minds. Taylor grabbed Marcus's arm roughly, forcing him onto his stomach as Hobbs cuffed his wrists. The cold metal bit into Marcus's skin, a physical reminder of their refusal to listen. As they hauled him to his feet, the murmurs of the passengers filled the cabin, a mix of confusion and alarm. Marcus could see the fear and doubt in their eyes, but there was no time to explain. The officers led him down the aisle, their grips firm and their expressions set. For Marcus Hayes, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal wasn't just personal, it was dangerous. Every second he was detained was a second the president's security was left compromised. But as the officers marched him off the plane, their minds closed to the truth. He knew this was only the beginning. Agent Marcus Hayes was escorted through the airport terminal, his wrists tightly bound and his head held high despite the humiliation. The officers on either side gripped his arms with unnecessary force, their faces set with an air of self-righteous certainty. To them, they had neutralized a threat. To Marcus, the irony was stifling. His role was to protect the very individuals these officers believed they were safeguarding. Every step away from the plane deepened his frustration and concern. His absence from his post could jeopardize the president's safety. The journey to the airport security office felt interminable. Passers-by in the terminal glanced at the scene, their expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. A few pulled out phones, recording the procession, while others simply stared. Marcus didn't flinch. Despite the circumstances, he knew that composure was his most potent tool. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattle. Once inside the security office, the officers shoved him into a chair, the cuffs digging further into his wrists. The room was stark, its fluorescent lighting casting harsh shadows on the cold metal table before him. Officer Taylor loomed over him, arms crossed, while Hobbs hovered nearby, fidgeting nervously but maintaining a veneer of control. "We're going to get to the bottom of this," Taylor said, his tone sharp. "Start talking. Who are you really, and what were you planning?" Marcus stared at him for a long moment, then replied with calm precision. "I already told you. I'm Agent Marcus Hayes, Secret Service. My assignment is to protect the president." Taylor scoffed, shaking his head. "Secret Service? Do you expect us to believe that? You were carrying a weapon on a commercial flight, acting suspicious. You're lucky we got to you before something happened." Marcus leaned back slightly, his patience wearing thin. "Lucky?" he echoed, his voice steady but firm. "The only thing suspicious here is your refusal to check my credentials properly. The badge you confiscated, have you even looked at it?" Hobbs glanced at Taylor, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Taylor, however, dismissed the comment with a wave of his hand. "We don't need to play games. If you're who you say you are, someone will back you up. Until then, we're keeping you right here." Meanwhile, back on the plane, the senior Secret Service agents were growing increasingly uneasy. Marcus Hayes was not the type to abandon his post, especially on such a critical assignment. Agent Christine Walker, the lead agent on this operation, noticed his absence immediately and began making inquiries. When the airline staff confirmed that Marcus had been removed from the flight by law enforcement, Walker's concern turned to alarm. "This isn't right," she muttered, pulling out her phone to contact the president's chief of staff. Within moments, a chain of communication had been established, and the full weight of the president's team was set into motion. The gravity of the situation became apparent. Agent Hayes hadn't simply been removed, he'd been detained under a false and dangerous assumption. When the news reached the president, his face hardened with anger. "They detained my agent?" he asked, his voice low but steely. "On what grounds?" "They believed he was a threat," Walker replied, her voice laced with frustration. "They didn't verify his credentials, and now they've compromised your security." The president closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "Hold the flight," he ordered. "I'm going down there myself." Back at the security office, Marcus remained calm under the officers' scrutiny, though the weight of their ignorance gnawed at him. Every second they spent interrogating him was a second lost in protecting the president. Despite his measured responses, Taylor and Hobbs pressed harder, their questions becoming increasingly aggressive. "You're lying," Taylor accused. "People don't just walk around claiming their Secret Service without a reason. Who are you working with?" "I've answered your questions," Marcus said, his tone clipped. "You're wasting time, and in doing so, you're endangering the president. If anything happens because I'm not there—" Taylor cut him off, slamming a hand on the table. "Save it," he snapped. "You're not fooling anyone." At that moment, the door to the office swung open with force, and the president himself entered, flanked by his chief of staff and senior agents. The room fell silent. Taylor and Hobbs froze, their faces paling as they registered who had just walked in. The president's eyes locked on them, cold and unyielding. "Where is Agent Hayes?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. The officers hesitated, their confidence crumbling under the weight of the president's gaze. Taylor gestured weakly toward Marcus, his bravado gone. The president turned to Marcus, his expression softening. "Agent Hayes," he said, his tone sincere. "I'm sorry this happened. Let's get you out of here." As Marcus stood, relief washing over him, the president turned back to the officers. "We're going to have a serious discussion about this," he said, his voice a promise rather than a threat. For Taylor and Hobbs, the reality of their mistake was only beginning to sink in. The small security office was thick with tension as the president stood before the two stunned officers. His towering presence, though calm, carried an unmistakable authority that silenced every voice in the room. Officers Taylor and Hobbs were frozen, their earlier confidence shattered as they processed the magnitude of their error. Agent Marcus Hayes stood nearby, his calm demeanor masking the mental and physical toll of the ordeal. "Let me make sure I understand this," the president began, his voice steady but sharp. "You detained one of my most trusted agents, an individual tasked with ensuring my safety, because you assumed he was a threat?" Taylor opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Hobbs shifted uneasily, his gaze darting between the president and Marcus. Finally, Taylor managed a weak reply. "Sir, we thought he had a weapon, and he was acting. Unusual. We believed it was suspicious." "Suspicious?" The president's tone hardened. He turned his gaze to Hobbs. "Did he offer you identification?" "Yes," Hobbs admitted, his voice barely audible. "But we didn't think it was real." "You didn't think it was real," the president repeated, his disbelief evident. He glanced at his chief of staff, who handed him the confiscated badge. He held it up for all to see. "This is an official Secret Service badge. It's real. You had this in your possession the entire time, and you still chose to treat Agent Hayes as a criminal. Explain to me how that makes sense." Neither officer could respond. The room was suffocating in its silence. The president stepped closer, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "Your assumptions didn't just embarrass an innocent man. They put lives at risk. My life, the passengers' lives, the lives of every individual on that plane. By removing Agent Hayes, you left my protective detail compromised. That is not just reckless, it's dangerous." Taylor and Hobbs exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of their actions sinking in. Taylor, struggling to find his voice, stammered, We didn't know, sir. We thought we were doing the right thing." The president's eyes narrowed. "You thought? Or you assumed? Because what you did was act on assumptions rooted in prejudice, not evidence. And in doing so, you undermined the very security you claim to protect." He turned to Marcus, his expression softening. Agent Hayes, I owe you a personal apology for what you endured today. Your professionalism and patience in the face of this injustice are a testament to your character. Thank you for staying calm when others failed to. Marcus nodded respectfully. Thank you, sir. My priority was, and always will be, to ensure your safety. I appreciate your understanding. The president turned back to Taylor and Hobbs, his gaze icy. You owe Agent Hayes an apology, he said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. The officers hesitated before Taylor stepped forward. Agent Hayes, he began, his voice shaking slightly. We're deeply sorry for what we did. We let our biases cloud our judgment, and we made a terrible mistake. Hobbs added, We didn't give you a fair chance. We're sorry for the way we treated you. It was wrong. Bad, and we'll learn from this. Marcus met their eyes, his expression steady. Apology accepted, he said, his voice calm but firm. But understand this, what happened today isn't just about me. Racial profiling has no place in your profession. It's dangerous, it's unjust, and it compromises the very mission you're tasked with upholding. The president nodded in agreement. Agent Hayes is right. What happened today is unacceptable. This is not just about a mistake, it's about a systemic issue that must be addressed. If you continue in your roles, let this be the last time you allow bias to dictate your actions. Taylor and Hobbs nodded solemnly, the weight of the lesson pressing heavily on them. Yes, sir, they murmured in unison. The president gestured toward the door, and the group exited the office. Marcus walked alongside the president, his posture straight, his composure intact. The officers remained behind, their expressions a mixture of regret and shame. As they made their way back to the terminal, the president glanced at Marcus. Let's get you back to your post. The flight won't leave without us. Yes, sir, Marcus replied. And as they walked, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, not just to protect, but to continue standing firm against the biases and challenges that had defined this day. For Marcus, this was more than a victory. It was a moment to inspire change. Agent Marcus Hayes walked alongside the president through the bustling terminal, the whispers and stares of onlookers following their every step. Despite the humiliation he had endured, Marcus held his head high. This was not the first time he had faced bias in his line of work, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But he knew his professionalism and integrity would always rise above the assumptions of others. For him, today was about more than his own dignity. It was about ensuring that lessons were learned and changes were made. As they approached the gate, the president slowed his pace and turned to Marcus. Agent Hayes, he said, his tone heavy with sincerity, what you went through today should never have happened. I can't change the past, but I can ensure we address this issue head on. You've shown an incredible amount of restraint and professionalism. Thank you. Marcus nodded. Thank you, sir. My only concern was ensuring your safety. I'm just relieved the situation didn't escalate further. The president placed a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder. Your actions today reminded me why I trust you so deeply. Let's make sure this becomes a teachable moment, not just for those officers, but for everyone in positions of authority. Back at the airport security office, Officers Taylor and Hobbs remained in the dimly lit room. Their confidence eroded and their actions were playing in their minds. The weight of their error was sinking in. Taylor finally broke the silence. We were so sure we were doing the right thing, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But we never stopped to question why we felt that way. Hobbs sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. We didn't see him as a person. We saw him as a threat first, and that's on us. The words hung in the air, the gravity of their realization palpable. For the first time, the officers began to understand the damage their unchecked biases could cause, not just to Marcus, but to the people they were sworn to protect. It wasn't enough to admit their mistake. They knew they needed to change. Meanwhile, as Marcus and the president reboarded the flight, the cabin filled with an uneasy quiet. Passengers who had witnessed Marcus's earlier removal now watched him return with the president at his side. Some averted their gazes in embarrassment, while others nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Marcus didn't dwell on the stares. His focus was on resuming his duty. As he settled back into his seat, Agent Christine Walker leaned over from across the aisle. You good? She asked, her voice low. Marcus gave a small nod. I'm fine. Just another day on the job. Walker smiled faintly, her respect for her colleague evident. You handled it well, better than most would have. Marcus shrugged slightly, his composure unwavering. Had to. There's too much at stake. The plane finally began to taxi down the runway, and Marcus allowed himself a moment to reflect. The events of the day had been frustrating and exhausting, but they had also underscored an important truth. Assumptions and biases were not just personal failings. They were systemic issues that needed to be confronted. As a Secret Service agent, Marcus had faced more than his fair share of challenges, but he had never let them deter him from his mission. Today was no different. Back in the security office, Taylor and Hobbs were left with instructions to attend mandatory training on bias awareness and de-escalation tactics. Their commanding officer, who had been briefed on the situation, made it clear that such errors would not be tolerated in the future. As the plane climbed into the sky, Marcus glanced out the window, the sprawling city below shrinking into the horizon. The day's events had taken their toll, but they had also reignited his commitment to his role. He wasn't just protecting the president. He was standing against the very prejudices that sought to undermine justice and fairness. For Marcus, this wasn't just a lesson for Taylor and Hobbs. It was a reminder for everyone in positions of power. Assumptions can blind, biases can harm, and trust must be earned through fairness and accountability. And while Marcus knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges, he also knew he would face them with the same quiet strength that had defined his career. In the end, the day was more than a test of Marcus's character. It was a call to action for those who had failed to see beyond their biases. And as the flight carried him toward the next chapter of his duty, Marcus resolved to continue leading by example, proving that integrity and determination could prevail over prejudice. As the flight soared through the clouds, Agent Marcus Hayes sat quietly in his seat, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He had been wronged, doubted, and humiliated, but he had also persevered. For Marcus, the ordeal was a stark reminder of the challenges he faced, not just as a Secret Service agent, but as a man who carried the weight of societal bias alongside his professional duties. Yet, even in the face of adversity, his resolve remained unshaken. Across the aisle, Agent Christine Walker stole a glance at Marcus. She admired his calm demeanor, knowing how easy it would have been for someone to lose their temper or succumb to frustration. Instead, Marcus had chosen composure, a choice that had not only protected the president's mission, but had also served as a lesson to everyone involved. "Marcus," Christine said quietly, leaning closer, "you know what you did back there, right? You didn't just handle the situation, you taught them something. Those officers, the passengers, everyone, they won't forget today." Marcus turned his gaze toward her, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe," he replied, his voice steady, "but it shouldn't take a situation like this for people to learn. Racial profiling, bias, it's exhausting and it's dangerous. Today, it almost jeopardized the president's safety. Tomorrow, it could cost someone their life." Christine nodded, her respect for Marcus deepening. "Still," she said, "you kept your cool. You represented what this job is really about. That matters." Marcus allowed a faint smile to cross his lips. "Thanks," he said simply. Then, turning his attention to the window, he let his mind wander to the larger implications of the day. For the two officers who had detained him, this would undoubtedly be a day they would remember. The president's words, sharp and unrelenting, had left an indelible mark on them. Their assumptions, rooted in bias, had led them to make a critical mistake, one that not only embarrassed them, but also endangered lives. Marcus could only hope they would take the lesson to heart, not just for themselves, but for the countless others they would encounter in their careers. The president's intervention had been swift and decisive, a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated. It was a rare moment of accountability, one that Marcus knew would resonate beyond the confines of the airport security office. Yet, he also understood that systemic change required more than a single reprimand. It required consistent effort, education, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Back in the security office, Officers Taylor and Hobbs sat in silence, the weight of their actions pressing heavily upon them. Taylor's earlier bravado had faded entirely, replaced by a deep sense of regret. "We messed up," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Big time. Hobbs nodded, his expression grim. Yeah, we let our assumptions take over. We didn't listen. We didn't think. Their commanding officer had made it clear that this was a turning point. Both men would undergo mandatory bias training, but more importantly, they would need to rebuild the trust they had broken, not just with Marcus, but with themselves. It was a humbling realization, one that left them determined to approach their duties with greater care and fairness. Back on the plane, Marcus closed his eyes briefly, taking a deep breath. Despite everything, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about protecting the president. It was about standing as an example in a world that often judged first and questioned later. He knew that his strength, patience, and professionalism had turned what could have been a disastrous situation into a teachable moment. As the plane descended toward its destination, Marcus opened his eyes, the city lights below twinkling like scattered stars. The challenges he faced were far from over, but he was ready to meet them head on. For Marcus, every step forward was a victory, not just for himself, but for the ideals he stood for: justice, integrity, and the unwavering belief that change was possible, even in the face of the deepest prejudices. This day would not define him, but it would fuel his determination to continue fighting for fairness and accountability. And as he prepared to disembark, Marcus Hayes carried with him not just the weight of his badge, but the knowledge that his example might inspire others to see beyond their assumptions and to act with the same courage and conviction he had shown. As the wheels of the plane touched down on the tarmac, Agent Marcus Hayes felt a sense of closure, not just to the journey, but to the day's harrowing events. He had faced down bias, ignorance, and injustice, and emerged with his integrity intact. But the impact of what had happened wasn't something he would soon forget. For Marcus, this was more than an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a broader struggle that millions faced every day. The president, seated a few rows ahead, turned briefly to glance at Marcus as the cabin lights brightened. Their eyes met, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. The president knew how much had been asked of Marcus that day, more than his duty should have required. He had been tested not just as an agent, but as a man, and he had risen to the occasion with a quiet strength that demanded respect. As passengers disembarked, many cast lingering glances in Marcus's direction. Some offered subtle nods of acknowledgement, while others seemed unsure of how to react. Marcus met their gazes with calm assurance, refusing to let their judgments define him. He had done his job, and he had done it well. At the terminal, the president approached Marcus with a firm handshake. "Agent Hayes," he said, his voice low but resolute, "you remind us all why we trust people like you to stand between us and the dangers we often overlook. Your actions today weren't just professional, they were exemplary." "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied. "I'm just doing what I was trained to do." The president smiled faintly. "It's more than that. You set an example, not just for me or my team, but for everyone watching. You showed them the strength of composure, the power of truth, and the importance of treating others with dignity, even when it's not returned." As the president's entourage moved on, Marcus lingered for a moment, watching the busy terminal around him. He couldn't help but think about the officers who had detained him. They had acted out of fear and prejudice, but he hoped they would carry the lessons of the day into their future interactions. The thought gave him a sense of purpose. Change might not happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere. Walking toward his next assignment, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about the passengers, the officers, and even the president. Each of them had witnessed a moment that could have gone horribly wrong, but instead became an opportunity for growth. Marcus hoped they would carry that growth forward, using it to question their assumptions and make better choices. As he stepped into the next phase of his duty, Marcus carried with him the quiet resolve that had always defined his work. His mission was far bigger than any single flight or assignment. It was about safeguarding not just individuals, but the principles that made his service worthwhile: fairness, justice, and the unwavering belief in the potential for change. In the end, Marcus Hayes knew that his strength lay not in his badge or his title, but in his ability to stand firm against adversity and inspire others to do the same. And that, he realized, was the most powerful weapon of all.